Welcome to the Black Ponderer. I'm Neil Trotter, your host, and today we're going to be discussing some more continental philosophy. We're going to be returning to Hegel, and we're going to be discussing his lectures, specifically his lectures on the history of philosophy. This is volume 2 of that, and let me pose for the thumbnail. Get a good shot here. There you go. So I've been reading through Hegel's lectures, honestly trying to prepare myself for the phenomenology of spirit, which we will inevitably be covering on this channel for sure. That's coming up, but this is a very complicated work. So I thought I'd get started with some of his lectures that will introduce me to Hegel's way of thinking. And in that way, I'll have some background on his thought process, like where he's kind of getting his ideas, what does he think about philosophy in general, and I think that'll help. So if you read his lectures on the philosophy of history and the history of philosophy, he brings up this idea about the notion, which is what this translation, which is available on Project Gutenberg, that website. You can get a lot of free texts that they're aged out of the copyright. This notion is this idea that there is a position or an objective or some sort of state that humanity or existence is going toward. And to understand this trajectory, where is existence headed, we need to understand the history of existence. And if you were just talking about human beings and the philosophy of human existence, well, we need to discuss the history of human beings, right, and their existence. And by doing that, we can start to unravel, okay, where are we going based on where we've been in the past? So I want to continue with that discussion because I think that's really important. A lot of people miss that, right? And I think that's an important discussion. History is a great way for us to understand why we are in the position that we are in now. A lot of people ignore history. They're like, well, that happened in the past, it doesn't matter anymore. But if you look at the current state of the world, right, a lot of it can be determined based off of history. Not all of it, a lot of it you got to look at the present too, but a lot of it can be explained through history. So let's get into that. I want to read to you this quote or this block of text that I'm about to present to you. Hegel is talking about Plato, and he's going through Plato's history and his contribution to philosophy. And I think this is pretty interesting. We can talk about this, and if you happen to have this text, this version, this is page 108, the second to last sentence of the first paragraph here. So Hegel says, Plato would further have preambles to laws wherein citizens who would be admonished as to their duties and convinced that these exist, etc. Okay? They also should be shown how to choose that which is most excellent, in short, to choose morality. Okay? Morality, ethics. Very important in philosophy, the topic. And Plato had a lot to say about that. Let's talk about what Plato thought through the lens of Hegel's historical analysis. So I'll continue. But here we have a circle. The public life of the state subsists by means of morality. And conversely, morality subsists by means of institutions. Morals cannot be independent of institutions. That's a key thing. Morals cannot be independent of institutions. Okay? We're going to focus on that. That is, institutions cannot be brought to bear on morals through educational establishments or religion alone. For institutions must be looked on as the very first condition of morality, for this is the manner in which institutions are subjective. That's important to pause here and talk what's being discussed here. It's very important to think about the institutions that we live in. Okay? And when we talk about what's wrong in society, we can't just look at individuals, right? We also have to look at the institutions, right? The systems. Problems are often systemic, right? They go beyond the individual, or they influence individual morality. I think oftentimes we do get trapped in this moral conundrum where we're trying to argue and debate about what's right and what's wrong, and we accuse people of certain things, and then we get personally attacked, and we miss the whole idea that, well, the problem is bigger than just you and me. The problem is systemic. Our institutions operate with this immorality. I shall continue. Plato himself gives us to understand how much contradiction he expects to find. And even now, his defect is commonly considered to lie in his being too idealistic. So here, Hegel's like, okay, Plato's not perfect. Right? He's got some flaws or some mistakes in his philosophical analysis. And that's true. He does. I mean, Hegel also has flaws in his philosophical analysis. Nobody's perfect, but Plato is very important. That's why Hegel's talking about him. But it's important to think about this. While his real deficiency consists in his not being ideal enough, for if reason is the universal force, it is essentially spiritual. Thus, to the realm of the spiritual belongs subjective freedom, which had already been held up as a principle in the philosophy of Socrates. So what is all that? Hegel's bringing up spirituality. Now, we got to be careful about spirituality, because when we start talking about institutions, and then we start talking about spirituality, which may lead to religion, there's a key moral argument of separation of church and state, right? Is that a good thing? Yeah, I would argue like the separation of church and state is good. But then when you think about that, or when people argue for the separation of churches and state, or when people say things like, oh, we need God more involved in politics, or like, why don't they put the 10 Commandments in schools again, where kids can learn, the 10 Commandments, even though they might not even be Christian. You got to be careful about that. So we're being cautious as we read this. Is Hegel, does he got something wrong here too? I will continue reading. Therefore, reason ought to be the basis of law. And so it is on the whole. But on the other hand, conscience, personal conviction, in short, all the forms of subjective freedom are essentially therein contained. This subjectivity, at first, it is true, stands in opposition to the laws and reason of the state organism, as to the absolute power which desires to appropriate to itself, through the external necessity of wants, in which, however, there is absolute reason, the individual of the family. So, Hegel is bringing up this conflict between individual morality and state morality or institutional morality. Laws should be determined by reason. Okay, that's what's being said here. As opposed to personal conviction. The individual morality can conflict with the state organism. And we see that, right? We see that all the time. People are debating, like the abortion argument. People argue the state shouldn't be involved in that. A woman should have the right to choose. But then you have the other argument where it's abortion is murder, and I use some various verses in the Bible to justify this. So how do we reconcile this? Is there a way to do it? We say that reason ought to be the basis of law. So then does that dismiss spirituality, which Hegel also brings up? This is essentially spiritual. So are we just saying actually it's not? Well, let's keep reading and we'll find out. Individual conscience proceeds from the subjectivity of free will. connects itself with the whole, chooses a position for itself, and thus makes itself a moral fact. But this movement of the individual, this principle of subjective freedom, is sometimes ignored by Plato, and sometimes even intentionally disparaged, because it proved itself to be what had wrought the ruin of Greece. And he considers only how the state may best be organized, and not subjective individuality. In passing beyond the principle of Greek morality, which in its substantial liberty cannot brook the rise of subjective liberty, the Platonic philosophy at once grasps the above principle, and in so doing proceeds to farther. So what's being said here? Let me consult my notes that I wrote in the margin to help us discern what has been said. I put, the Republic says, the Republic is one of Plato's works where Plato talks extensively about political philosophy. In that work, what's moral for society overrides individual freedom. And Hegel's like, well, wait a minute, what about individual freedom? Isn't that important too? Don't just ignore that. And I also put in my notes, societal needs aren't necessarily bad. Sometimes giving up individual freedom to benefit society is good. But it is important to think critically about social needs to determine its morality. Okay? So, what we have to think about here is really critically analyzing and deeply considering the individual situation. And, being careful not to take extreme stances, right? Because in today's society, and particularly in my country, United States of America, people are really obsessed with individual freedom. And many people will say, like, well, individual freedom overrides safety, or my personal individual freedom is more important than your personal safety. You got to be very careful about that, right? Personal freedom is important. It is. But to a certain extent, it becomes very dangerous, as we're seeing in the world today. An example will be like the global pandemic that's happening. There are many people who don't want to wear masks, right? This is just an example. They're saying like, well, this, takes away my personal freedom. It's like, well, at a certain point, it's moral to give up a little bit of personal freedom for the good of society, is it not? And now we're talking about spiritualism, or being spiritual about it. Now we're looking at it morally, instead of like just your personal individual needs or wants. But there's more to it than that. So let me continue here. In regard to the exclusion of the principle of subjective freedom, this forms a chief feature in the Republic of Plato. It specially harmonizes with this particular quality of excluding the principle of subjectivity that Plato, in the first place, does not allow individuals to choose their own class. This we demand as necessary to freedom. So in the Republic, I have a video of that if you'd like to check it out. But in the Republic, Plato offers this way of governing where the people who call the shots, the people who are in charge, are philosophers. The term philosopher king, and who decides who are philosopher kings is not determined by personal freedom. Let me continue reading. It is not, however, birth which marks off the different ranks and determines individuals for these, but everyone is tested by the governors of the state, who are the elders of the first class and have the education of individuals in their hands. According as anyone has natural ability and talents, these elders make choice and selection, and assign each man to a definite occupation. This seems in direct contradiction to our principle, for although it is considered right that to a certain class there should belong a special capacity and skill, it always remains a matter of inclination, which class one is to belong to. And with this inclination as an apparently free choice, the class makes itself for itself. But it is not permitted that another individual should prescribe as to this, or to say, for example, because you are not serviceable for anything better, you are to be a laborer. Everyone may make the experiment for himself. He must be allowed to decide regarding his own affairs as subjective in a subjective manner by his own free will, as well as in consideration of external circumstances. And nothing must therefore be put in his way if he says, for instance, I should apply myself to study. What's being said here? Is this a contradiction to Plato, or this notion of personal freedom? It should be overrode for societal good or societal safety. Well, if you take it to the extreme, yes, but if you be more critical about it and be more philosophical about it, we don't have to go that route. And it's very important to make this distinction, right? Let's bring back the whole mask wearing example again. It's like wearing a mask in public is not the same thing as the government determining which class you are or which role you're going to play in society. That's not the same thing. Right? Now, in Plato's Republic, he is describing that. However, what we do as thinking beings in today's contemporary world is we take what Plato said, right? We incorporate the good and we disregard the bad. So using philosophy and reason to determine law, yeah, that's a good idea. Should it be the case that people don't get to decide what they want to do in life? Everything is predetermined in advance? No, right? But you decide which is bad and which is good, and you use the good and you disregard the bad. And that's what you do when you analyze history. You learn from what's been good throughout history, and you also learn from the mistakes of history or the bad lessons of history. And you have to be critical about it. So let me continue reading. Let's return to the idea of morality and how it should be viewed in society. This is page 426. This is the second paragraph of that page. And here, Hegel is doing a historical analysis on this other philosopher, Plotinus. And he's talking about Plotinus' work that he did called Ennead. Now, if you don't know who this philosopher is or what the Ennead is, it's not important. The idea is what's important. So let's talk about this idea. In the 8th book of the first Ennead, Plotinus says, but how is evil recognized? It is owing to thought turning away from itself that matter arises. It exists only through the abstraction of what is other than itself. That key word, other. So, what is evil? Evil is when the self turns away from itself, when it doesn't recognize itself, when it sees itself as some other. What's going on there? I'm going to continue reading. What remains behind when we take away the ideas is, we say, matter as in mass, atoms, and neutrons, protons, matter, right? Thought, accordingly, becomes different. The opposite of thought, since it dares to direct itself on that which is not within its province. Like the eye turning away from the light in order to see the darkness, which in the light it does not see. And this is a seeing which yet is non-seeing, so that experiences the opposite of what it is in order that it may see what is opposed to itself. This abstract other is nothing but matter, and it is also evil. The seeing of the less measure is nothing but a non-seeing. So what does this mean? Well, let me consult my notes in the margins. The process of othering is evil because it is rejecting the truth of interconnectedness. So let's go back to that example. You're wearing a mask. Why? I want to preserve my personal freedom. But what about the risk of you spreading the virus to other people? Well, excluding some people believing that the virus doesn't exist, not taking that into account, there's a lot of people who are just like, look, my personal freedom is more important than safety. Some people just are going to have to suffer for, personal freedom. I would argue that is an othering. That is, what's happening there is you are focusing on yourself, and you're not looking at other people as yourself. You're not recognizing the interconnectedness that you have with other people. When you hurt other people, you hurt yourself. And this is this evilness that Plotinus is talking about. I will continue reading the quote. The sensuous in regard to measure, or the limited, is the less measure, the boundless, the undefined, unresting, insatiable, the utterly deficient. Such is not accidental to it, but its substance. Its aim is always becoming. We cannot say that it is, but only that it is always about to be. So that's the idea, Hegel's idea of the notion again. Is, look, we are developing, we're going somewhere. Existence is reaching an objective. There's a trajectory that has a meaning to it. And the way we uncover that meaning is through an analysis of history. And I would add to that and say the trajectory is not based off of one single individual, right? You have to analyze humanity as a whole. And so you have to start thinking in terms of our interconnectedness, how our dependence on each other, and how that dependence influences where we're going. When you look at it that way, personal freedom is not the end-all be-all, because you also have to take into consideration the societal good, or more specifically, the interconnectedness that we all have, the ecology that we all share. I'll continue with the quote though. The soul which makes reason its aim is pure, holds off matter and all that is indeterminate and measureless. But why then, when there is the good, is there also necessarily evil? Because there must be matter in the whole, because the whole necessarily consists of opposites. It would not be there if matter were not present. The nature of the world is compounded of reason and necessity. To be with the gods means to be in thought, for they are immortal. We may also apprehend the necessity of evil in this wise. As the good cannot exist alone, matter is a counterpart to the good, necessary to its production. Or we might also say that evil is that which by reason of constant deterioration and decay has sunk into it, can sink no lower. But something is necessary after the first, so that the extreme is also necessary. But that is matter, which has no longer any element of good in it. And this is the necessity of evil. So what are we talking about? Evil is necessary? Well, how is that the case? Well, let me consult my notes. The process of discovering our interconnectedness, of becoming aware of the other, which is that othering, or that a realization that there is this other, right? That's evil, right? But then rejecting like, wait a minute, there is no other. I thought there was an other, but actually there's not. Rejecting it as an untruth, because ultimately, when you're saying, oh, that other person is not as important as me, or doesn't impact me in my life, which is not true, right? Once you make that realization, then you move from evil to good. Okay? And in this way, the evil is necessary, because it is the entire process of life. right? The entire process of life is realizing, wait a minute, there is no other. When somebody, we're going back to the example of wearing a mask, and somebody says like, well, I don't want to wear a mask because you're violating my personal freedom. To develop as a human being, to fulfill this notion that Hegel is talking about, that person needs to realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm putting other people at risk, which puts me at risk because ultimately I am not separate from that other person. As we could see, right? If we think about how a virus spreads and how it operates, the more people that are infected, the more endangered you are personally. This global pandemic really hits home how interconnected we are and how individual actions affect everybody. And once you begin to realize, wait a minute, what I do affects other people and it ultimately affects me. So should I really be looking at this person as an other, right? This realization is a moving from evil to good. So really, it is definitely a discussion of morality, and I would argue when Hegel brings up the spirituality portion of it, when he talks about, well, we got to consider also the spiritual aspect of it. I would say like that is the spiritual aspect of it. And we talk about like, well, are there good people and evil people? No, what it is we all go through this process, this ignorance of like, oh, I am this myself, I am this person, and I need to do things for myself, and what other people have to do has nothing to do with me, right? And that type of thinking negatively impacts society as a whole, which isn't a kind of evil. And all human beings go through this process, or they start at that process, right? And many human beings make that philosophical leap. They realize, wait a minute, like what I'm doing actually hurts other people. And then it's not a situation where it's like, well, I need to consider the feelings of other people because that's good, even though that is very, it's good to be considerate of other people. But then also making that other leap where it's like, well, not only am I helping that other person, but by helping that other person or reducing the risk and danger of that other person, I'm actually reducing the risk of and helping myself. So in that way, the separation that I thought I had with this other individual is far less than what I originally thought. Are we really that different? And that's the good that's being created there. So that's just some food for thought right there as I read Hegel's volume 2 of his History of Philosophy. I will continue reading with his volume 3, and we'll make a video about that as well. So stay tuned for that. But I just want to thank you for watching, and if you got some comments and considerations and some feedback, and maybe you disagree with what I'm saying, hey, that's what the comment sections are for. We're all about philosophical discussion here. So talk to me. But hey, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.